Order, order. Marcia de Corver to move the motion.
Yes. Thank you. And I beg to move that this House has considered e-petitions 632748 and 651094 relating to low traffic neighbourhoods and accessibility. They call for an independent review and an exemption for blue badge holders. It is a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Mrs. Harris, and I want to start by congratulating the creators of the petitions, which were signed by over 17,000 people, Mike Spencer and Mark Delory, who are here today. Many thanks to the Petitions Committee for producing the survey that was also completed by over 7,000 people, which I will be referencing in my speech. Low traffic neighbourhoods, or LTNs, are traffic control measures which reduce motorised traffic within a limited area. They are intended to make active travel more comfortable and enhance public spaces for pedestrians. Studies have shown that there are benefits from improved road safety to better health outcomes as people are encouraged to walk and cycle rather than drive. However, their introduction has proven to be controversial in some of our communities. There is an irony in the fact that the introduction of LTNs were intended to bring communities together. However, in some cases, they have now become a source of controversy. The Petitions Committee survey found that 78% of respondents said LTNs had a negative or a very negative effect on them, with only 17% saying LTNs has a positive or very positive effect on them. Mrs. Harris, I support the efforts to create a more sustainable transport system and actions to tackle what is a climate emergency. And it is my intention to use today's debate to present some of the challenges and put forward recommendations that can be taken to prevent the problems that so many of our communities have been experiencing. Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. Over 28,000 deaths a year are linked to air pollution, and would my honourable friend, who's making an excellent beginning to her speech, agree with me that much more needs to be done to monitor air pollution and to reduce air pollution so that we can improve the quality of our lives and that of our residents and constituents?
My honourable friend will not be surprised to hear that I absolutely agree with her, and I will come on to that in my speech. But it's really important that we tackle air pollution and air quality, but also we tackle some of the inequalities that may also come about as a result of some of the changes that are being introduced. Now, while the basic idea of LTNs date back to the 1970s, the latest wave and the name are far more recent. During the pandemic, the Conservative government encouraged local authorities in areas with high public transport use to reallocate road space as a measure to help enforce social distancing and encourage active travel. Statutory guidance was issued and the government's Active Travel Fund was providing money for LTNs as experimental traffic orders, or ETOs. Many would argue, Mrs. Harris, that this is where the problem possibly started. While the reasoning behind the introduction of LTN measures was understandable given the circumstances, the way in which they were implemented has created problems. As they were introduced as ETOs, the usual legal obligations to carry out a full consultation were often waived, and some councils decided to perform their public sector equality duty on a roll-in basis. This resulted in changes being imposed on communities without their input, approval, often without sufficient information, as well as little regard for the equalities consideration. I will.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I stated back in March 2022 that I was concerned that continuing the rollout of LTNs in my area at that stage, before bus prioritisation, for example, would worsen congestion, further negatively impact impact bus uptake and increased division around active and public transport measures in Oxford's communities. The timing of introduction, as she's stating very clearly and in a very eloquent speech just now, of LTNs in cities like Oxford has underlined the lack of a joined-up approach to these issues. Does she therefore share my concern at the manner in which the Conservative government initially funded these projects, stating LTN money could not be used for longer-term, more integrated transport plans? And does she agree that while many local residents will understandably support LTNs within the streets they live on, if we're to tackle the climate crisis, we've got to ensure everyone can get from A to B and travel in a cleaner, greener way, not just those on higher incomes. So, for example, people who live on council estates surrounding city centres also need to have their transport needs considered.
Absolutely. Again, my honourable friend has made the absolute point about ensuring that you have to bring communities along with you in this journey, but also some of the challenges that the government really haven't addressed. If I just make some progress. So, Mrs Harris, common complaints of LTNs have included the shifting of traffic to boundary or sacrificial roads, increased congestion, barriers for emergency services, worsening pollution, and a negative knock-on effect on public transport. Many communities who have been impacted by traffic moving to densely populated areas are from poorer and Black, Asian and ethnic minority backgrounds. One survey respondent described the impact as the traffic was pushed out of an extremely wealthy area and onto the roads of the poor. The result was complete gridlock. The arterial roads remain highly congested to this day, and it is horrible and stressful to be stuck in polluted traffic for hours on a journey that really should take mere minutes. The introduction of LTNs has been, in some cases, had a greater impact on disabled people. 96% of those who responded to the survey said LTNs had a negative or very negative impact on them. Some of the concerns they face included the installation of bollards, planters, locked drop curbs, excessively longer journeys, which is not only inconvenient but leads to higher costs, and the failure to exempt blue badge holders from these schemes. Increased travel times aren't just mild inconveniences, as many disabled people can often find commuting far more exhausting. In the most extreme cases, the added hassle caused by longer journey times makes travel difficult, robbing them of the energy they need for when they actually arrive at their destination. Worryingly, travel times were also linked to increased costs in terms of petrol and also taxi fares, adding again to the financial burden borne by disabled people, with the potential to prevent them from travelling, or worse still, keeping them trapped in their homes. In the words of someone living with multiple conditions, they said, the LTN had added to my journey times and costs, and also my fatigue levels, an increase due to extra stress in travelling. Added to this, I suffer with anxiety, as my multiple sclerosis means I sometimes need access to a toilet quickly. With my journey time now increased threefold, it makes it very difficult.
My honourable friend give Merck?
Yes.
I thank my honourable friend and I congratulate her on the excellent speech she's making. She describes an LTN which sounds as if there is physical barriers. Would she not agree with me that where an LTN is enforced through camera technology and residents can enter or leave their homes by the route that suits them best, then they don't suffer from the problems that she's just described so well?
Done properly, making sure that the routes are accessible are going to be crucial, and using technology such as cameras is a way, and this is something that I do come on to shortly. But that's fine, don't need to apologise. But moreover, not all LTNs have blue badge exemptions, and the issue is the focus of one of the petitions we are debating today. Although LTN schemes are different everywhere and councils have different policies for blue badge holders, disability is not a geographical issue, and the lack of exemptions had led to there being a postcode lottery. Now, one respondent to the Petitions Committee survey said, I cannot take my mother, who has a blue badge, to her medical appointments, as it would result in going through an LTN and getting a fine. Now, recently, Southwark Council in London had to scrap their plans for a low-traffic neighbourhood after a backlash from residents, including local disability groups, as blue badge holders and disabled motorists would not be exempt. Now, Mrs Harris, many of the benefits of LTNs brought in don't always benefit disabled people. For instance, active travel measures like cycling infrastructure aren't always accessibly designed with a standard two-wheel bike in mind. Narrow cycle lanes can't be used by trikes or other non-standard vehicles. So it really is, it's about creating that inclusive public realm. Accessibility issues around LTN show that society is rarely designed with the needs and interests of disabled people in mind, which often leads to them being excluded. In fact, many of the apparent issues far predate the introduction of these schemes, stemming instead from the existing barriers. They are inaccessible because street spaces themselves are not inclusive. Therefore, simply removing them isn't a solution, as the status quo wasn't always inclusive and accessible to begin with. Now, a basic principle of disability rights movements has always been nothing about us without us, signalling the importance of consultation and co-production in any policy making which impacts our lives. Given the sometimes routine exclusion from decision making, this approach to policy development has and will have a wider impact. Poor consultation on low traffic neighbourhoods and their imposition in a time of national crisis has really allowed this controversy to arise. Now, at first glance, Mrs Harris, the Department for Transport's review in March this year shows support for LTNs. However, the responses were based on a limited set of data, with the survey's features limited to residents within only 4 geographical areas and had a low response rate. The review also failed to consult public health professionals, older and disabled people's groups, and those representing Black, Asian and ethnic minority communities. Now, the government has issued guidance around the implementation and monitoring of LTNs going forward, which could help ensure future schemes are more inclusive and have community buy-in and community support. But given some of the concerns with the government's review, there is a case, as outlined in Commission 632748, for an independent review which has a specific focus on the impact on disabled people and consults all the relevant people and stakeholders. And I would ask, when the Minister rises to his feet, whether he can actually say whether the government could agree to this. In the short term, LTNs must permit access to blue badge holders, as Mike Spencer has called for in his petition. A more sophisticated design might also include cameras, as my honourable friend mentioned, to permit other vehicles allowing disabled people to access areas via any vehicle they choose, including taxis, as not all disabled people are blue badge holders, and in those cases, many of them will be reliant on public transport, including taxis. Another recommendation could be for the temporary suspension of LTNs introduced during the pandemic until legal obligations and assessments of proper traffic baselines have actually been carried out. Excuse me. Although they are the responsibility of local authorities, will the government consider updating guidance so that it can adopt such an approach? Current guidance is based on legislation that can lead to statutory requirements to consult. But if a traffic regulation order is made, then key stakeholders like the police, ambulance services must always be consulted. But there is also a requirement in the regulations to consult other organisations representing people likely to be affected by these provisions of the order, as local authorities will see fit to do so. But has the government considered amending this legislation to place a mandatory requirement on consulting with other groups and stakeholders, such as those representing disabled people? Mrs. Harris, LTNs can work in certain areas if they are supported by the community, which includes those living in the boundary and also on the sacrificial roads. To enable this, will the Minister agree to develop maybe a national framework for local authorities to use when planning new LTNs and monitoring existing new schemes? As I close, successful and sustainable improvements to our transport system and public realm must always consider the interests of all those who will be affected. Disabled people know this all too well. However, the interests of all communities everywhere can benefit from this simple lesson. We can avoid the problems that we are seeing today, and I think, really, all of us in this debate today can take this point, and I'm sure that the House will all also agree that for a system or schemes to work, it's so important that we bring our communities together behind us so that all of these schemes can actually be successful going forward. Thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petition 632748 and 651094 relating to low traffic neighbourhoods and accessibility. Teresa Villiers.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I thank the Honourable Member for Battersea for introducing this debate on behalf of the Petitions Committee, and I thank every one of those members of the public who chose to add their names to those petitions and take part in this debate. Now, thankfully, I represent a constituency in Chipping Barnet that hasn't actually had low traffic neighbourhoods inflicted on it, and I'm here to argue that we do not want them. We've seen how they operate in next door Enfield, and we do not want that kind of traffic mayhem transported into our borough. I just want my constituents to be able to get to the places they want to be without too much unnecessary hassle. And a successful economy also depends on movement and mobility. Schemes which deliberately cause traffic delays by restricting access to our road network cause economic damage. Ultimately, they make the economy grow less vigorously than it would have otherwise done, and they make everyone worse off than they would otherwise have been. And as we've heard from the Honourable Member for Battersea, this is not just an issue that impacts on people who drive cars, it's people who are in buses, in taxis, in vans as well, all hit by the congestion caused by LTNs. We all know that local businesses suffer when their customers and suppliers find it harder to get to them, which is another consequence of those schemes. But simply, it's people's freedom to live their lives in the way they want is restricted by this kind of anti-car measure, by inflicted unnecessary delay and headaches on them. And yes.
She makes a powerful point that people should live their lives as freely as possible with too many interventions, and therefore they should be free to use their car. Does she not recognise that other road users, like people who walk or cycle, or young people who try to walk to school but feel that cars are actually endangering them or making them less free to use the road, are on the other side of the argument?
Of course, I'm a strong supporter of measures which have a positive impact on cycling safety. And we must make sure that the rules of the road get the proper balance to ensure that we protect vulnerable road users. But I do not believe LTNs are the way to deliver that. Yes.
Surely, like me, the Honourable Member represents an outer London borough, suburban borough. Are there really, in her constituency, no residential roads which are continuously a traffic jam as rat runners queue to get to the main road by missing the main junctions? The freedom of those residents, like those who were in Wellesley Road in Chiswick, or those in the Teesdales in Isleworth, before the LTNs were implemented, they did not have the freedom to go home or leave home in their own cars because of the continuous traffic jams outside their homes.
Of course, I accept that there is rat running that takes place, but again, I do not believe that LTNs are the right way to deal with that. There are alternative ways to manage traffic that should be considered first. And I have to say, I'm especially concerned that older people who perhaps don't find it as easy to get around as perhaps they used to are particularly disadvantaged by LTN schemes, since These are a generation who may be especially dependent on their cars or on taxi transport. Now, it would certainly help if blue badge holders were exempted from these schemes, but that doesn't cover the millions of people with very real mobility impairments which are not serious enough to qualify for such a badge. And, you know, the rationale of these schemes is if we're told it's to get us out of our cars and make us walk and cycle, but what about the parents of young families who can't simply load their young family onto a bicycle as blithely advocated by the Mayor of London and TfL? And we also live in an era of increased awareness and concern regarding crimes against women. So we must also listen to the women who may feel real fear and insecurity because an LTN means that they can no longer be dropped off right outside their home by a taxi when they come home at night, that they may find it more difficult to get taxi transport because they live in an LTN. I believe that the equalities impact of LTNs and a whole range of anti-car measures has not been properly taken into account before these schemes were introduced. Now, as I've said before, I'm a strong supporter of measures to improve cycling safety, but dogmatic measures forcing cars out of more and more road space are not the right answer. And the air quality benefits of LTMs are heavily contested. The additional congestion that they cause on main roads may well worsen emissions in those locations. And these are often, of course, places where many people who have lower incomes live, including many people from minority ethnic communities. Again, the equalities impact of these schemes is severe. Because the reality is traffic doesn't evaporate when you close roads, much as TfL would wish it to. It just moves to a different road. So an area can be told to put up with increased emissions because a more affluent nearby street has demanded an LTN. I believe these projects can be extremely socially divisive, and that's been very clearly illustrated by the debate in places like Tower Hamlets. Roads policy from the Mayor of London and London Labour boroughs have too often seemed to reflect the views of a limited number of vocal pressure groups rather than the broader consensus of opinion, rather than embracing the views of women, minority ethnic communities, the elderly, the disabled. And I feel that consultation has far too often been inadequate, not least because it tends to focus only on the people who live in the streets to be included in the LTN and ignores those who travel through those streets or the roads onto which traffic is displaced. Yes, happy to take it.
She's been very generous, and I thank her for it. I used to be a councillor, not in my current constituency, but in another local authority. And the problem was always the problem of consultation, which I fully agree with, that not more people are consulted also on planning applications. But the argument is always, it is what is mandatory. So what a council must do in order to consult, and that's quite narrowly put. And usually councils, and we know that they're all cash-strapped, don't have the ability to consult more widely. Would she agree that we need actually a mandate to control more widely, but also the funds for that?
If these councils aren't able to consult adequately, they should not be introducing these schemes in the first place. And I have to say, over the past 24 hours, I've received emails from many people, particularly in London, but beyond as well, which seem to me to be more or less a kind of a cry for help and frustration because of their lives having been turned upside down by these schemes. In my view, LTNs are an experiment which has failed. They're harming our economy, they're harming our capital city, they are punishing people just for trying to get around in a bus or a car or a taxi. I think it's time to halt the introduction of new LTNs. It's time for the government and the minister to intervene to start removing existing LTMs. This madness has to stop.
Sorry. Vera Hophouse.
Thank you, Chair. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair, and thank you for having just upgraded me to Sir Vera. But it is a very good debate that we are having, and I congratulate the honourable member for introducing this debate so thoroughly, and that we are having, and I congratulate the people who have signed the petition so we can have the debate. That is, of course, the whole point of these debates, that they come to the House as people want us to debate certain issues that they think we should debate. And I'm always in favour of that, and it is very important we do, and I congratulate everybody who has signed the petition so that we discuss this here thoroughly. In many of our local councils, low traffic neighbourhoods have become very contentious with both opposition and support. The term LTN is new, the concept is not. The planning principles of LTNs have been used in street design since at least the 1960s. The concept has suddenly become controversial because of the motives of such LTNs, such as reducing traffic, encouraging active travel, and it is at odds with the government's new-found pro-driver policy. And this is where I really want to make a point. Most of us are all sorts of things. We are motorists, we are pedestrians, we are cyclists. So we are road users in all sorts of ways. And for me, it is absolutely important to look at it in the round and understand the different uses of the road by all different users, and particularly, and again, it has been mentioned already today, to make sure that vulnerable road users are not excluded from our streets. So that is an important principle that all local councils need to adhere to. Now, in Bath, my local council, they have been very brave, introducing a wide range of LTNs, 12 in total, and they have, of course, currently created a lot of reasons why people write into me. But if I look at it in terms of a proportion, I have had 57 people write into me on LTNs, and I have 70,000 people in my constituency. So while it is, of course, a relatively large number, we always have to sort of think about how big is the number of people writing in. We usually get the people who don't agree with what is being done rather than agreeing with what is being done. And we also have within the 57 people who actually are agreeing with them. And I read you one out from this morning saying, "Dear Vera, I just wanted to write in support of these zones. As a cyclist, walker and motorist, they are wonderful for those neighbourhoods. I live on the da-da-da estate, and there have been moans about the LTN on Sidley Place, but I have not noticed a change in the congestion myself, and I fully support the trial." And here I also want to say I congratulate my council for having been brave, but also making it as a trial. These LTNs are trial LTNs. Councils now have to be very careful about supporting what they introduce with data, and I have challenged my own council on really providing that data to local communities and to those who are opposing them. I have facilitated that local groups who are, as a group, opposed to a particular LTN have the access to councillor and council officers, and make sure that we're having that discussion in order to make sure that people really understand what they're for, what is being measured, what is actually the achievement result, what does the council want to get out of it, and how they can actually improve our neighbourhood. So it is important that each council is absolutely transparent about what they want to achieve, provide the data, communicate and engage, as we have already heard, and make sure that we include as many people as possible into the debates of how we want to get forward as a council. An official study commissioned by the Prime Minister intended to show that LTNs are unwanted, but actually concluded they are generally popular, particularly once they're implemented. The Department for Transport surveyed residents in LTN trials areas in London, Birmingham, Wigan and York. An average of 45 of respondents supported the schemes and 21 opposed them. 58 were unaware they actually lived in a low-traffic neighbourhood. It is no wonder the government delayed the publication of these findings, because it ultimately produced the opposite of what the government thought it would produce. Despite these results, from their own report, the Department of Transport has already said it will no longer provide central funding for LTNs. There are no plans to cut councils off from DVLA databases. This debate must be evidence-led, and as I've already said, it is really about what is the evidence, not what people fear. And change is always difficult. Managing change is one of the most difficult things that you have to do as a politician. And I remember that also well from my own council time. People are afraid, and they're afraid of change. And the most important thing we need to do as political leaders is to make sure that we respond and communicate about the fears that people have about change. So this debate has to be evidence-based. There are some legitimate concerns, as we have already heard. For example, disabled people worry about their mobility. In most cases, proper consultation, comprehensive exemptions, and more accessible transport options are solutions that widely dispel those fears. LTLs themselves must be fully accessible with dropped curbs and no street clutter, otherwise disabled people feel penalized for driving without access to alternatives. And as I've already said, whenever there are concerns about that, people can write into me. And usually, these fears are being dispelled once people fully understand how these schemes are implemented. LTNs have clear benefits. They improve air quality, increase the number of journeys made by walking and cycling, and show reductions in street crime. After 3 years, a study found street crime decreased by 18%. An even larger reduction was found for violent crimes and the most significant reduction for sexual assaults. One study found a 50% reduction in road casualties within LTNs and no increase on neighbouring roads. And I know the Right Honourable Member for North East Somerset is going to speak because what is being done in Bath City Centre will affect the neighbourhoods in his constituency. And what people fear, again, will be the result of what happens in neighbouring wards or neighbouring or boundary streets. And the clear evidence of surveys that are being done shows that this is not the case. And if there is evidence, of course, we need to look at that. Early findings indicate that LTNs make neighbourhoods make neighbourhoods a lot more safe after they have been introduced. Air pollution is an invisible killer. A claim often made by opponents of LTNs is that emissions increase outside the designated LTN. There is little evidence to suggest that this is the case. Researchers at the Imperial College London found that NO2 declined by 5.7% within livable neighbourhoods and 8.9% on boundary roads. The government's own report acknowledges that by reducing traffic and emissions, LTNs contribute to a cleaner, safer environment. Improvements to air quality coupled with increases in active travel contribute in healthier lifestyles with long-term benefits on reducing demand on the NHS. It is unfortunate that an unhelpful argument has broken out between central government and local authorities. Local authorities want to work with government to reduce emissions and make our roads safer. But this government is intent on reducing councils' abilities to do so. And in her response, the Right Honourable Lady has already said, well, councils should consult more widely. I agree with that, because it's the best way of increasing democracy and allowing people to actually be part of the decisions that are being made in their neighbourhoods. But councils don't have the money and resources to do so. So the mandatory requirement is very limited, and the money that is put towards that to consult in a wider way, councils are being hampered basically to do so. So I would absolutely agree, councils must consult wider in order to increase and include a wider group of people. But then they also need to have the money to do so, and currently they don't. But it would be great for democracy, I really would say so, except then we have to think about how wide are we consulting? Is it the whole of the city? Is it the whole of the city and North East Somerset? Is it beyond North East Somerset? And therefore, often councils end up to consult just the neighbours that are directly affected. As I say, I'm sad that it has ended up in this debate when we could have actually have an agreement across with our communities, with local government and central government. I'm happy to give way, yes.
I'll speak at greater length at a later stage, but the main thrust of the petition seeks a review That is what the government have done. That is what we are debating today. It is a review of LTNs. And she is characterising us as this is a them or us situation. With respect, I'm not sure that is a fair approximation of what is a review sought by the petitioners, which is exactly what the government have provided.
I thank him for that intervention, and yes, absolutely, I agree. It's meant to be a review, but I find the argument is very often skewed towards the people who just object to it, and I'm happy to listen to what the government has to say in response and what the review process is actually producing. But as I say, we are in the middle in my constituency in Bath in a very big discussion about LTNs and the principles of it, and I speak as a constituency MP. Implementing LTNs must be bottom-up and not top-down. Councils must work closely with residents when they're intending to implement LTNs. I look forward to the wider discussion, but as I say, there are many, many benefits that have been proven about the principles of LTNs, and I hope those principles are not being neglected when the government is conducting its review. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Harris. May I begin by saying what a pleasure it is to serve under your chairmanship, and thank you for understanding that I won't be able to stay till the very end. And I also congratulate the Honourable Lady Member for Battersea for her very fine introduction of this important discussion, and my right honourable friend, the Member for Chipping Barnet, whose speech I agreed with almost in its entirety. And it's a particular pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady, the Member for Bath, because my seat is a donut seat. And Bath, the Honourable Lady, is the jam in the centre of the donut, and I am the sort of heavy, leaden dough that surrounds the Honourable Lady's jam. And that's why I wish to speak on this debate, because of the effect that LTNs are having on my constituents. And really, the anti-car policies that are being introduced have a big effect on people living in rural areas, because they affect them as they try and go about their business without the concomitant benefits. That it doesn't help you if you live in a rural area that an LTN comes in a city that you need to go through or that you wish to do business in. The fact that it also has effects on the businesses within the city is perhaps more a matter for the Honourable Lady than it is for me, although many of my constituents own and have interests in businesses in Bath as well. And we've touched on the issue of consultation. As I understand it, with regard to the Sydney Place scheme, opposition to it has been 100 to 1, and that over 4,000 people have signed a petition against it. Not just the 57 who may have written in to the Honourable Lady, but thousands of people living nearby who will be affected by this. And the thing we have to remember is that 78% of journeys, and this is from 2022, were by car, of miles driven. And that we are, however much we wish to pretend otherwise, a society, a nation, an economy that is based on the internal combustion engine. That is where, as my right honourable friend from Chipping Barnet said, where our economic activity comes from. It's how people get to their jobs, it's how people take their children to school. And we have to make a choice as a government and as local councils as to what approach do we take to politics. Do we really think that we should be telling people how to lead their lives, tell them what's good for them and make them do it? Of course I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
Is saying, and I don't know his seat well, but he has described it as being a donut of effectively countryside around Bath. But would he not agree that if everybody who lived in the centre of Bath, or everybody who lived in London, who could drive, drove everywhere, that the whole road system would be gridlocked, and that by providing safe alternatives, decent public transport, safe routes to walk and cycle, that actually it enables the alternatives which take a lot less space than everybody driving their own vehicle?
The Honourable Lady says that, but the self-same council that is keen on these low-traffic neighbourhoods has cut the buses in my constituency. They've kept most of them in Bath, but the ones in the rural areas they've cut like the billio. Of course I'll give way to the Honourable Lady. And
this is, of course, the Wrecker Mayor who's cut the buses in Bath, and we, as local council, have made many I'm not the local council, but my councillors have made many representations. Can I just ask him too? Traffic in Bath has been one of the biggest issues ever since I turned up in Bath, and this is now over 10 years ago. How does he say, and traffic has increased, has doubled in the last 15 years. How does he propose we are dealing with that issue?
I'm glad the Honourable Lady asks me that question, because before the Lib Dems took charge of the Bath North East Somerset Council, I was working with the previous council on the Bath bypass, which would have been the most sensible thing to do to join the A36 and the A46. But in accordance with this whole LTN anti-motorist approach, as soon as the Lib Dems got in, they didn't want the bypass. Why? Because they hate the motorist. They don't like people taking charge of their own lives. They think they know best and they want to tell them what to do. And that's why this approach is so bad. And I would encourage my honourable friend, the Minister, to take away the funding from these schemes and to apply the rules that I think came out on the 17th of March, the guidance, to make those into firm law and to implement them on schemes that are already in place. Because we should be on the side of freedom and of liberty, of people going about the lives that they choose to lead, rather than thinking that we know best. And the thing that has reduced pollution has not been LTNs, but it's actually been improvements in the internal combustion engine, and most crucially, the move away from diesel engines. But bear in mind, it wasn't that long ago that the no-all government was telling people it was such a good thing to have diesel engines. They were pushed into having them. The percentage of diesel engines in this country went shooting up. Why? Because the government of the day wanted to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and ignored the emissions from particulates and oxides of nitrogen. And this led to a decline in the air quality where cars were, which is being improved as people have been going back to petrol engines or improvement in diesel engines. And that is the way to do it, to maintain liberty and freedom and choice, to recognise that the overwhelming majority of journeys are taken by car, and that the free flowing of traffic is essential to our economy. And the government made a decision in the emergency of the pandemic to do something that seemed to be a solution at the time. Now, many decisions were taken during the pandemic that with hindsight turned out to be wrong. This is one of them. It's time to reverse it. It's time to back freedom and back the motorist.
Pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I would also like to congratulate my honourable member for Battersea for her excellent introduction to this debate. I welcome the opportunity to contribute to a review of low traffic neighbourhoods, but I certainly would hope that they are not stopped, as the members for Chipping Barnet and North East Somerset have suggested. There have been measures in my constituency in place to create what we might now call low traffic neighbourhoods for decades. On Chiswick Lane, a barrier that keeps traffic cutting through from Chiswick High Road to the A4 via Airedale and Netheravon and Beverley Roads. It's been there for over 40 years. Walpole Road in Isleworth is now closed to through traffic, trying to take a shortcut from the A316 over to Old Isleworth. Pears Road in Hounslow, that was a back road avoiding Hounslow High Street and Hanworth Road. Chiswick Common Road, long since cut off a vehicle route from Chiswick High Road to Turnham Green Terrace. These have been there for a long time. They use physical barriers like bollards and planters. And no one has contacted me or their local councillors demanding their removal. And if they were to be removed, those barriers, there'd be many, many objections. These measures to prevent rat running were implemented because there was an issue for residents on those roads. Drivers avoiding traffic jams on main roads using residential side roads, particularly that really grew over the last 10 or so years following the mass use of real-time sat-navs. I certainly will.
I thank her for giving way. Will she agree that a council just doesn't pick out issues out of thin air, but actually responds? Because other residents have written to the council in big numbers to say that they want to see some change. It's not because the council just decides to do something to annoy people.
Thank you. She makes a good point. My experience is with Hounslow, and I'll come on to say more. I can't say that for every local authority, whether they all implemented change that was needed or whether they plucked ideas out of thin air in 2020, but certainly in Hounslow. But the nightmare for residents who live on roads that are rat runs, as I say, particularly since the mass use of sat-navs, is it varies. So at some times of the day, it's speeding. At other times, continuous traffic jams outside their roads, spewing fumes, and literally meaning those residents can't drive in or out of their own homes or their own road by vehicle should they want to. Living in this environment cuts the freedom of children and older people to feel safe in their own neighbourhood and be able to feel safe walking about, particularly at junctions and crossroads. We also know the national figures show that more people cycle where they feel safe because so many of us own bikes but are not brave enough to cycle when roads are busy. All the low traffic neighbourhood measures that were implemented in 2020 in Hounslow were in neighbourhoods where or on roads where residents had long been angry with the impact of rat running and had been calling their councillors, I was one of those councillors, for action for years. The 2020 government measures implemented during COVID, probably the one thing I can compliment the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson for. They provided regulatory change and funding to make implementation by local authorities quick. They used temporary measures to try out what worked. And as I say, that's what Hounslow used. Some roads that are now low traffic neighbourhoods as a result of that work. The whole South Chiswick area, which I'll come on to shortly. Green Dragon Lane, a road of almost all social rent housing where only a minority of people have use of a private vehicle. Occupation Lane in Brentford, again, the top end of a council estate. The Teesdales near Westminster Middlesex Hospital, where there was continuous battles between drivers trying to pass each other on a narrow road with resident parking. Since, in these and other roads in Hounslow, since the LTN measures were implemented, they're achieving exactly what residents had asked the council to do by stopping through traffic using their road as a shortcut. But it allows them to, yet those measures allow them to pass freely in and out of their own homes, to walk to and from home safely, especially when crossing at the corners. No longer long traffic jams spewing out fumes and drivers getting angry when trying to pass. And sometimes the schemes were revised. One that was tried that was to remove through traffic from Turnham Green Terrace in Chiswick, a very popular shopping street, but with very narrow pavements. The idea was to make it more business friendly. But local councillors asked for it to be removed, and so it was. They can be modified. So another popular shopping street, Devonshire Road, was closed completely after concerns by the retail shops, but not the restaurants and bars. The retail shops wanted to see through traffic. So now in Devonshire Road, through traffic goes through that road so that they can access the shops during the day, but it reverts to a traffic-free road with tables and chairs outside on the carriageway, which benefits the restaurants and bars in the evenings. And physical barriers are not the only tool, and in many ways are often a far better tool to create a low-traffic neighbourhood. And Hounslow has made extensive use of camera technology and camera enforcement so that any vehicle can enter and leave a neighbourhood or a road when driving whichever way suits them. So long as that vehicle enters and leaves by the same way that it came in, or arrives, stays, and then leaves later. And then I want to address school streets very briefly, a subset of Liverpool neighbourhoods. There have been over 30 in Hounslow, and head teachers have told me of the benefits of school streets. It's cut out a lot of the conflict between the tiny minority of parents who insist on driving their children to school and the much larger number of parents who are walking their children to school and get very angry by the behaviour of some selfish drivers. Those drivers are no longer able to access near the school. And what one head teacher told me is that an awful lot more families are now walking to and from school rather than making a couple of 100 yards vehicle trip every day. Now, I want to now address Hounslow's largest low-traffic neighbourhood. It started life before COVID, and it was known as the South Chiswick Livable neighbourhood. Rat running had long been an issue through South Chiswick, as vehicles sought to avoid the Hogarth roundabout when travelling from the A3 and the A316 to then head west on the M4 or A4, or other drivers driving either way between Chiswick Bridge and Kew Bridge parallel with the River Thames. Thousands of vehicles per day were travelling straight through that neighbourhood without stopping, and most of them were long distance. They were not local Chiswick vehicles. In 2019, before COVID, after full consultation, residents supported, in principle, the implementation of the livable neighbourhood for South Chiswick. It was actually implemented because prior to that there hadn't been funding available, so it was implemented in 2020 using the COVID emergency measures. The impact has been significant. A 50% drop in through traffic, more people walking and cycling, and a drop in average vehicle speeds. And on the boundary roads, not greater traffic jams and higher volumes, but between a 2.8 and a 9.3% cut in traffic on those boundary roads, despite the closure of Hammersmith Bridge, which does actually suggest that low traffic neighbourhoods encourage a modal shift away from private vehicle use and towards public transport, walking and cycling. And most remarkable, the most remarkable impact we've seen in Chiswick is the loss of a council seat in the 2022 council elections to the party that campaigned vigorously against the low traffic neighbourhood that had been implemented 2 years earlier. For the first time in 48 years, there was a Labour councillor elected to represent Chiswick Riverside Ward. Hardly evidence that local people hate the LTN. Mrs Harris, following concerns raised locally, Hounslow has made improvements to that scheme, perhaps could make some more. I'd like to see improved signage, warning drivers that they're entering an LTN. And maybe another suggestion is the use of a one strike and then you're fined to warn people that not to drive through there again while not getting away. I know I've been fined for not being able to see a sign in an area I didn't know very well. I got a fine. I was a bit annoyed with myself. It was a school street and I was driving through just at the very end of the school street restrictions. And yeah, that does annoy people and doesn't help people's ability to support what I believe overall are very good policies. There's no doubt that restricting through traffic in an area does achieve the purpose required if it's done well, if there is a need. Less pollution directly outside people's homes, safer roads, easy access for residents. There's national evidence that, that there's more walking and cycling in quiet areas, and where there is walking and cycling in retail areas, particularly Walthamstow Forest being the best example in Walthamstow town, strong economic benefits to local businesses and high streets. We know the benefits in tourism areas where there is easy, safe, segregated cycling or quiet areas to cycle. And I don't know how many other people go look for cycling opportunities when they're going on holiday, because good cycle measures are a draw to tourists. So in conclusion, low traffic neighbourhoods, if implemented where they're needed, properly consulted on, use clear signage and appropriate technology, i.e. camera enforcement or bollards and planters as appropriate, can work. The question is, do you...
Will my honourable friend
yes, of course, yeah.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank my honourable friend for her speech. As she is drawing to a close, and she said how they can work, I just want to really pick up again on the issues around the barriers that disabled people face. And would she not agree with me that it's important that any low traffic neighbourhood, any design of it, should be done co-produced with disabled people and their organisations to ensure that they are inclusive? And does she agree with me that those who have a blue badge should be exempt from the scheme?
Thank you. Thank you. Well, as another front bencher, I will defer to my colleague on the front bench. But it seems to me that exemptions for blue badge holders would make sense for the reasons she gave in her speech. But let's remember, disabled people, disability is not one thing. Some disabled people rely on a private vehicle to get about. Many disabled people cannot drive for all sorts of reasons. Many particularly frail elderly people can walk short distances but need to know they feel safe. They want to know that they are seen at the corners of a road when they're trying to cross. So pedestrian build-outs and so on, clear crossings are absolutely essential. Good design is important, and where appropriate, segregation between pedestrians and cyclists, so that no one fears being mown down by somebody cycling too fast in an area that should be for pedestrians. And that's particularly true with one form of low traffic neighbourhood, which are retail areas, pedestrianised town centres. And I think that's, but I'm not sure we're actually talking about them in this context. As I draw to a conclusion, nobody likes getting a fine for driving a route they always have done, but there's no reason why councils can't use, as I say, a first strike, then a fine, this for the second time, for those who didn't notice the change signage. And I agree that we should look at the blue badge holders being exempt, particularly if it's a barrier-based LTN and the alternative is a long journey round the long way. And if the proposals aren't working and delivering the improved environment that those residents had said they wanted, then they can be reversed and something else be tried. Mrs. Harris, the majority of my constituents do not have sole use of a private car, and being in London, do have alternative choices to travel. And these roads in LTNs, those who live in roads with LTNs should have the choice, so that should they want to restrict their road, they can, and not have to have the choice that their road is used as a shortcut by other drivers imposed on them, particularly those drivers who aren't even local, such as in our case, driving between Surrey and Heathrow Airport. Why should our residents have to put up with those drivers using their small residential roads as a shortcut? Thank you.
Lightwood.
Thank you very much, Ms Harris. And it's an honour to respond to this debate on behalf of the official opposition with you in the chair. And my thanks also to the Honourable Member for Battersea for sponsoring this debate, and to all who've added their names to these two important petitions. A petition calling for an independent review into low traffic neighbourhoods, and a petition calling for the exemption of blue badge drivers from low traffic neighbourhoods. I'd also like to thank all the other honourable members for their contributions this evening, and I've been getting better, Ms Harris, at learning the place names for my individual members, but bear with me if I get any of these wrong. The member for Lewisham East, it's quite right that we must continue to work hard when it comes to air pollution and to reduce its impact on constituents. The member for Oxford East, that there needs to be a joined-up approach. I quite agree with that, and that everyone should be able to travel from A to B in a green way. The members for Chipping Barnet and North East Somerset. Well, I heard a lot about the so-called war on motorists and that there was alternatives to it. Didn't hear many alternatives raised, I have to say, but I thank you for your advocacy on behalf of your constituents. But I think it does show the importance of proper consultation and considerate planning. The member for Battersea, low traffic neighbourhoods can work when they're supported by the residents that it affects, but it must include consultation and co-production with disabled people as well. The member for Bath, we agree, effective consultation is really important, and that the views of all the different kinds of road users should be taken into account, and crucially, that the debate must be based on evidence. And finally, the member for Brentwood and Ellsworth, right to draw attention, of course, to the ongoing consultation about LTNs. And so where there is a clear need for change, that action is taken on that. And also, really important that you recognise, I think, the positive impact on school zones as well. Low traffic neighbourhoods, or LTNs, have become a common part of many communities across the country in recent years. They play an important part in delivering safer streets, cleaner air, and helping to encourage people to use active travel to get around, which we know helps benefit local economies, improves physical and mental health, and helps to bring down carbon emissions. In many areas, LTNs have become a core part of life for the communities that live in them, with many enjoying the reductions in noise pollution and air pollution that have occurred thanks to the reduction in congestion due to roads being closed through traffic. Obviously, there often needs to be exemptions to this: emergency services, public transport, permit holders, and sometimes taxis. But the overall reduction in most through traffic from LTNs is still significant. Studies have shown that in areas where LTNs have been introduced, traffic has been reduced by 32% on average, with only a 4.5% increase in traffic on boundary roads. Nitrogen dioxide pollution has fallen by up to 9% in some areas with these schemes. In LTNs in Waltham Forest, road injuries have fallen by up to half compared to before the schemes were introduced. And data shows that 61% of people living in low traffic neighbourhoods support the schemes. It is important to talk about the benefits of these schemes because, despite what the government try to say, the evidence shows that for the most part they are popular with local people and effective at achieving the desired reduction in levels of pollution and road injuries. But of course, not everybody that lives in low traffic neighbourhoods is supportive of the schemes. Some have legitimate criticisms of how these schemes have been designed and implemented. And in some individual cases, there have arguably been a failure to consider the needs of particular groups, including, as is the subject of one of the petitions, those with limited mobility and blue badge holders. I think we can all agree that local authorities that introduce these schemes should ensure that accessibility needs are carefully considered and indeed prioritised as they design and consult on proposals. Many low traffic neighbourhoods do already exempt blue badge holders, but many also do not. The government's own review on low traffic neighbourhoods has found that of the LTNs surveyed, 38 LTNs exempted blue badge holders, whereas 34 did not. It's clear that more can be done to ensure LTNs consider the needs of those with limited mobility. And I'll be very interested to hear the Minister's views on how the needs of disabled people and those with limited mobility can be considered from the start of the process when it comes to designing and implementing low traffic neighbourhoods. Because there is a balance to be struck here between ensuring that the needs of all constituents are properly considered and supporting the right of local communities to make the right decisions for their areas. And that point, that this is a decision for local communities themselves, is extremely important, because measures to improve road safety around schools and in residential streets are vital for the safety of children, are often demanded by local communities themselves, are essential to meeting legally binding objectives set by central government on air pollution, for instance, and are ultimately decisions to be made by those who know their local areas best. Ms Harris, Labour's position on low traffic neighbourhoods is clear. They are decisions that should continue to be made by local authorities, not decided by diktat from Whitehall or from Westminster. Of course, these decisions must be made with proper consultation, taking on board the concerns of each community. Central government does have a role to play to ensure that this is the case, but go too far and you risk undermining the independence and autonomy of the elected local decision makers who know their areas best. Although I appreciate the strength of views in the petition calling for a review into LTNs, as colleagues have already noted, the government recently commissioned and published such a review just weeks ago. This came after the Prime Minister claimed he wanted to stop harebrained safety schemes and stop the so-called war on motorists. So let's look at some of the findings from this review. 58% were unaware that they lived in low traffic neighbourhoods altogether. Of those who were aware, more people were positive than negative. A clear majority of people were concerned about the number of vehicles travelling through their areas and were equally as concerned by the pollution caused by those vehicles. Not exactly the outcome it appears the Prime Minister was looking for when he commissioned this review, Mrs Harris. Perhaps that's why it was reported the government tried to permanently shelve the report. And it would be remiss of me not to point out the pure hypocrisy behind this apparent about-turn by the government on low-traffic neighbourhoods. As, despite decrying these schemes, which its own review has found largely inobtrusive and popular, as part of the so-called war on motorists, it was senior Conservatives themselves that championed the schemes from the start. In July 2021, a prominent politician described low-traffic neighbourhoods as transformational and warned, if you're going to oppose these schemes, you must tell us what your alternative is. Who was that? It was the disgraced former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. In November 2022, another distinguished colleague of ours in this House said that low-traffic neighbourhoods are entirely a matter for local authorities to make. Who was that? Why, it was the member for North West Durham, the chair of the Conservative Party. So would the Minister like to tell us what the current Prime Minister thinks the alternatives to these schemes are, and whether he agrees with the member for North West Durham that they are best left to local authorities themselves to decide on? It is increasingly clear that the Prime Minister's desperate attempts to deflect on this so-called war on motorists are just hollow soundbites with no substance behind them whatsoever. And just a quick look at his record confirms that. The cost of driving is soaring, with car insurance costs up by 80% in just 2 years. The charge point rollout for electric vehicles remains off track, with the government set to miss its own 2030 target for 300,000 public charge points by several years. And the state of our local roads today is just shocking, with more potholes on British roads than craters on the moon. So let me conclude by saying this. Despite the Prime Minister's and the Transport Secretary's desperate attempts to politicise local transport issues like road safety, school streets and reducing local air pollution, the evidence tells us that these schemes remain largely popular, effective and inobtrusive on most people's lives. And while the current Prime Minister may be keen to airbrush history, it was not too long ago that these very schemes were being championed by the most senior figures in his own party. Many of these LTN schemes are far from perfect, and there are perfectly legitimate questions about how to ensure these schemes are designed with sensitivity to the needs of constituents, especially disabled and those with limited mobility. And I look forward to hearing the Minister's views on how we can best support local authorities to do just that. But we should not forget the basic principle that decisions over local roads and local neighbourhoods are best made by those who live in those neighbourhoods and those who have been directly elected to represent them locally. These powers and responsibilities have been devolved to local government for many years. We should not let a desperate quest for political relevance from those at the top of government to lead us to put our lives at risk, fail to tackle harmful air pollution and backslide on the basic principles of local democracy. Thank you.
Minister Hoppenheim.
Well, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, Ms Harris, and I thank the Honourable Lady for the introduction that she has given in relation to this matter, and I also particularly thank everybody who has submitted their name and support for the respective petitions. If I just gently push back on the Honourable Gentleman who's just put things forward for the opposition, it is not a question of trying to politicise something when the very purpose of the Petitions Committee is that we in Parliament answer a petition, not from any of us. It is from the people who put forward their names to a petition, and then there are criteria at the Petitions Committee that we then try and address and answer those. And the first and fundamental, surely, is that whilst I will get into the substance of this particular debate, the nature of traffic management has existed under various statutory formats for some considerable period of time, and the implementation of what is now called low traffic neighbourhoods dates back to statute that is the Road Traffic Regulation Act of 1984, and as the Honourable Lady outlined in her area of Chiswick, there have been versions of that in some shapes or form for a very long period of time, and that local communities have coexisted with them on an ongoing basis. But there is no doubt that this is an issue that has caused concern and is upsetting, and in certain places, I say only certain places, dividing communities. It is also the case that the administration of the Blue Badge scheme, which is again something that dates back to the Chronically Sick and Disabled Persons Act of 1970, section 21, is something that is causing genuine concern, and I'm going to try and address that in detail, by reason of the implementation of low traffic neighbourhoods. I want to try and address this debate as calmly and as even-handedly as I possibly can. There are a number of reasons for that, both because I think it's the right thing to do as a government minister, where you're trying to navigate a different set of priorities in different local communities, but also clearly the purpose of the original petition is for government to have a review. The review that we have published on the 17th of March of this year is detailed and sets out in quite some detail the approach that the government takes, but it is a first version of that, the final version of which will be produced later this summer.
Just on the point of the review, will the Minister give way?
I will, of course.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Now, he will know that as part of any review, it's best to gauge the views of all key stakeholders. And one key stakeholder group that really didn't have an opportunity to contribute were older and disabled people. So, for example, the leading charity for transport issues, Transport for All, were not engaged or consulted on as part of this review. So will he agree to ensure that as he publishes the future review, they will be consulted? It's so important that the voices of disabled people and their organisations are heard in this. Will he commit to that?
With great respect, I'm going to push back slightly, because clearly one of the key purposes of this review, which I'm going to set out in quite a lot of detail, is an assessment that there are issues in relation to what is called exemptions and exceptions, which include, as part of that, vehicles where they are accepted from restriction, generally indicated on the traffic signs, can include permit holders, buses, taxis, but disabled badge holders. There then is a detailed section on exactly that point. There is further sections about how implementation should take place for that. More particularly, we are on an ongoing basis engaging with the Disabled Persons Transport Advisory Committee, which is called DIPTAC, via the Local Government Association and individual local government organisations. But I will return to that in a little more detail, if I may, with respect. The position is that the expansion of low-traffic neighbourhoods during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic clearly did take place, And in the rapid rollout, that has led to concerns that they were being imposed and that communities had not been fully involved in their development. There were also concerns that it did not properly take into account the needs of many organisations, including disabled people. And representations were made in a whole host of ways leading up to the actual review itself. But we have to accept that low traffic neighbourhoods can work where they are well designed and where there is, crucially, local support for them. But they can also do harm where they are poorly thought through and introduced with insufficient public engagement and support. I'm not going to give way to the Honourable Lady yet. I want to try and make some progress. I will, of course, let her come in at a later stage. This government has been clear that effective traffic management is not about dictating travel choices, but about enabling more choice in how people make their journeys. And local traffic measures must work for residents, businesses, and emergency services. And we can bandy about examples of successes and failures, and of which there are both. There is no doubt whatsoever. But it is quite clear that some communities have been so upset and antagonised by low traffic neighbourhoods, particularly in London. One can give the examples of Tower Hamlets, I believe in Ealing, I believe there's one in Streatham, and certainly I, as a cyclist in London, have experienced and seen those. I did a further visit on the Wandsworth Bridge Road last week, and some of those communities I've outlined have actually introduced low traffic neighbourhoods and then abandoned them. Similarly, where I live in the northeast, there was the low traffic neighbourhood was introduced in Jesmond and has subsequently been abandoned in circumstances where quite clearly there is impact upon the local community, upset about how they've been implemented, and more particularly a massive effect on businesses. And I think there has to be a due consideration of the impact upon local communities that we all like to represent in our local area, and the consequences of channeling all traffic, for example, onto one major road, whilst taking all traffic effectively, or reducing massively is a better way of putting it, I should say, reducing massively all side traffic, impacting on parking, then those businesses will unquestionably suffer a downturn in their local economy, and they have done so. I'm not going to give way as yet, so just let me make some progress. We do, I suggest, need to ensure that changes to local roads have properly taken account of communities' views and the way that they are implemented in a way that does not fundamentally dictate how people should travel. Now, the first petition under debate, and I want to keep returning to the petitioners, because that is the people who we are addressing here today, asked that government carry out an independent review of LTNs. Since the initial reply was sent in April of last year, the Prime Minister announced in July that he was commissioning just such a review. He also did, and the fair point has been made, he also set out the plan for drivers, and there was a fundamental effort made to try and look at all aspects of how transport was being made. The review commenced in LTNs in September last year and set out to ensure that such schemes are working for residents, businesses and emergency services who have not, with respect to the debate that I've heard today, been mentioned as much as I thought they would. This was a separate additional piece of a project to the work already underway to review schemes funded through the second tranche of active travel funding, including a deep dive into the impact of segregated cycle lanes and low traffic neighbourhoods. It included a literature review, a survey of local authorities in England, an in-depth study of 4 schemes, an interview with key stakeholder groups. The LTN review completed in January this year and concluded there are some significant key issues with the implementation of the LTN schemes in England. This was based on externally commissioned independent research and analysis carried out by an independent contractor. I'm not going to go into the details of the individual particular points that can be found upon reading, and I would strongly urge all colleagues, and there wasn't much reference to the actual document of the 17th of March, but I would strongly urge all colleagues to read that document in detail. But I am going to set out, if I can, because I have a little time, the opening couple of paragraphs, which is, last year the Department for Transport commissioned a review of low traffic neighbourhoods. The research shows that whilst they can work in the right place, and crucially where they are supported, too often local people don't know enough about them and haven't been able to have a say. Increasingly and frustratingly, we see larger and larger low-traffic schemes being proposed by some councils, despite concerted opposition by local residents and by local businesses, and then in some cases, as I've outlined, being removed again. This guidance makes it clear that this should not happen. It also sets out that even if they are introduced, councils should continue to regularly review low-traffic neighbourhoods, ensuring they keep their objectives, aren't adversely affecting other areas, and are locally supported. And this guidance makes clear our expectations and will consider how carefully councils follow it, along with other appropriate factors when looking at funding decisions. To finish on this point, and I'm not proposing to read out a very substantial review document, but ultimately government can make changes to the legal framework if advice is overlooked, although working cooperatively with local council is by far preferred. We need a fair approach where local support is paramount, and this government sets out how that can be achieved. Now, okay, I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I thank him for giving way. Everything that he's read out, I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with, because it is exactly about the engagement that local councils have. Does he not agree that for that reason it is exactly the right approach that Bath and North East Somerset Council is actually putting out a trial period of LTNs with proper success criteria that can be evidenced, and if an LTN doesn't work against the success criteria, they will be removed. Is that not the right approach? And is that not the right approach of Baines Council, Bath and North East Somerset Council?
Well, I don't propose to sit in judgment on individual local authorities' approach and how it is those individual local authorities are trying to persuade, and that is the purpose of this process, a local community that there should be restrictions on one cohort, that there may be difficulties with other cohorts. I include bus travel, I include emergency services, I include problems with the disabled, and make an assessment of whether an individual local authority is doing a good or bad thing. What I can say is that self-evidently that is not happening up and down the country at the present stage. That is patently clear. The reason that we can give that answer very clearly is that there are a large number of local authorities who are abandoning their LTNs. Bear with me, I'll let the Honourable Lady come in a second. But more particularly, in answer to the Honourable Lady, she should, with respect, be ensuring that her local authority, if she has that influence, are setting out an approach that tallies with this particular guidance, that ensures that individual businesses, individual disabled groups, individual key organisations like public transport, like emergency services, are not going to be so adversely affected. And I echo the point made by the Honourable Gentleman, Right Honourable Gentleman, I should say, representing North East Somerset, which is that there is a concern and a danger that those who are benefiting from an inner city benefit will be impacted by those on the outskirts of local communities. We have seen the exact same point with traffic exclusion zones and ULEZ, where there is very strong arguments for such measures. The centre of Bristol, for example, is a very small traffic management approach, but then the wider London version is hundreds of square miles, and the impact of that can patently be seen by the opposition by some groups and the way in which it's been implemented. So I hope that answers her particular point. I promise to let the Honourable Lady come in. I'll do so now.
I'm very grateful to the Minister for giving way. I wanted to ask whether he accepted that his department has been part of the problem here. He talked about enabling choice. I wrote to the Department of Transport back in spring 2022 saying that there was a need for a joined-up approach to this, saying that there were concerns about how bus operators were going to be operating following this, and that was critical for people who were not able to cycle or to walk. I got a response back that did not say that my city could have a joined-up approach, did not say that my city could have longer-term funding, instead just said this is the programme effectively, and if we really are going to have that kind of action towards the climate crisis, perhaps his department should have listened a little bit more.
Well, I slightly regret giving way to the Honourable Lady when she wants to raise an individual letter about her individual city in circumstances where I could bandy about the fact that, obviously, the nature of this review is that we are addressing what has been something that has been existing for many, many, many years. There is a process by which the government have tried to do this, and we think that we've come up with a balanced and measured approach. I'd also make the point that other aspects of the implementation of this has to be done, as is being done in her area, by her local authority. And it is for her local authority to take that local community with them. And if they are not taking that local community with them, then it is going to be incumbent on the local authority to look at it, how they are implementing that, and whether they are able to continue to sustain that. And with respect, a multiple of local, let me just finish this point, a multiple of local authorities have failed to do that and then had to abandon those schemes, which reflects, I'm afraid, sadly, badly on the local authority. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm really grateful, Tim, for giving way. Will he be clear with the House today that no more central government funding is going to these schemes? And also, government statements have indicated that there are circumstances where access to the DVLA database might be restricted. How bad does a scheme have to be before the government will consider taking that step?
Minister Opperman.
Well, I'm trying to, I probably shouldn't be taking so many interventions. I'm trying to answer the debate without being in a position of prejudicing the final version of what is an interim review. She is a very experienced cabinet minister of old. That's not a very fair way description of previous years. But she will understand I have an obligation not to prejudice the final version of this. But she can, I'll merely take her to paragraph 3 of the foreword, which I didn't read because I wasn't going to read the whole thing out, which was a consultation is also being launched on targeting the use of DVLA data by councils to enforce substandard LTNs and other anti-motorist traffic schemes. And there is definitely, if she goes to the actual review, passages contained therein in relation to funding, but much as I said as well, a preference is to work with local authorities, and it is only in extreme circumstances where the issue of funding in the nature she describes comes into play. But I would suggest she takes the individual document and bears with the final government version, which will be there and responded to. Do you know I'm not going to? I'm so sorry. I've taken multiple interventions, and I'm going to try and make some progress. I'm only on page 6 of the speech, which is only meant to be for 10 minutes. But the review that has taken place can flag particular concerns over the impact on disabled residents, the high numbers of penalty charge notices, the cost of the LTN schemes, and even concerns from individual emergency services that delays to crews caught up in LTNs could potentially risk lives. Those are not concerns that should be managed in any way. Many disabled residents, as well as groups representing the views of disabled transport units, felt that inadequate consideration had been given to their needs and the impacts of LTN schemes on disabled people. Several LTN schemes reported by local authorities to the DfT had not carried out equality impact assessments. We have tackled these issues, we believe, through the draft guidance, which sets out clear expectations for comprehensive and in-depth local engagement and full consideration of the needs of all road users in such a scheme. We are clear that we will not support LTNs in future unless they are designed and delivered having had regard to the new statutory guidance, which will apply to new and existing schemes. Whilst this is guidance, we reserve the right to take further action if local authorities don't follow it, and local authorities are expected to consider this guidance, and as with the new guidance on 20-mile-an-hour limits, those who do not follow it could find implications for the award of funding in the future. The department set that out already. I'll pass that on. Turning to the key accessibility point, the government is committed to improving transport accessibility and supporting disabled people to have the same access to transport as everyone else. The LTN review found that too many schemes had not fully considered the impact of the changes on disabled people. I'd make the point that local authorities are bound by the public sector equality duty, and it is for them to ensure that they fully consider the impact of any proposed scheme in such a way. Any infrastructure they install should be delivered in a way that enables them to comply with equalities legislation. The second petition we are debating requests that a flag be added to DVLA records to identify vehicles belonging to blue badge holders so that they can be automatically exempted from any restriction and not attract enforcement activity. Whilst I understand the concern here, I'm afraid that that is presently not a viable solution. I will try and address it in detail why. This is closed because clearly blue badges are linked to the individual and not the vehicle. A badge holder may travel as a driver or passenger in any vehicle, including a taxi or minicab, allowing them to access the goods and services they need to use more easily. Therefore, it is not possible to flag with DVLA every vehicle in which a blue badge holder may travel. Likewise, while local authorities have access to a record of blue badge holders in their area, badges are registered to the individual and not the vehicle they travel in. Notwithstanding this, our draft LTN guidance does make it clear that local authorities should always consider exemption for blue badge holders, deliveries and other essential services from restrictions. It also addresses things like emergency services. And again, I don't want to read the entirety of it, but I do encourage anyone passionately interested or who is contemplating this to look at the sections on exemptions and exceptions and how the individual situation for disabled people can be improved. It does set it out in quite a lot of detail. I also make the very strong point that, just to answer the Honourable Lady's point, where she particularly identified particular problems, that obviously there should be considered ongoing good practice principles of monitoring and evaluation in line with the active travel fund monitoring guidance. But where local authorities detect hotspots where a disproportionate number of PCNs are issued or representations or appeals are being made, that should alert them to a possible need to review the cause. Monitoring of PCN and challenge levels should be carried out from the outset. Now, that clearly includes the impact upon local communities, the impact on the disabled, the impact on individual businesses and the way in which the fines are being taken going forward. I cannot address much more, given the nature of this being an unfinished document the government has to respond to. Very well.
Very brief. It's just in my reading of the website, Department of Transport website and the Low Traffic Neighbourhoods research report, at no point does it mention that it's an interim or draft report. Could you just elaborate on that, and if it is an interim report, just explain when the final report is expected?
Mr. Opperman.
I'm afraid he's misinterpreted. The final report will be this summer. So the situation in terms of the way ahead is we need to find a way in which our local communities can take a particular process that has been around for a considerable period of time and that has been managed in local communities in, by and large, a satisfactory way, but it has clearly been expanded substantially over the last few years. And we need to find a way in which the government can provide the guidance and then local authorities can implement these schemes in an appropriate way. And if they are not implemented in an appropriate way, then clearly there has to be consequences. And I'd like to assure the petitioners, who are the most important people here, that we are working to ensure that local authorities give proper considerations to the needs of all users and gain buy-in across the local community in all shapes or forms when discussing and then implementing any such local authority LTN schemes.
Thank you, Mrs. Harris. So, firstly, can I once again just thank both the petitioners for both creating this petition, but also to the thousands of people that took the time to sign it, and also to the many thousands that also responded to the committee's survey on low traffic neighbourhoods and accessibility. I want to thank all the honourable members that spoke to. I believe it was a robust debate, despite the Minister's response. The member for Chipping Barnet, for Bath, also for North East Somerset, who's no longer in this place. My honourable friend from Brentford and Isleworth, our honourable friends, the member for Oxford East, and also for Lewisham East for their contributions. I must say, the Minister, in my view, failed to really address some of the points that I raised in my question to him in relation to the accessibility of the scheme and the need for an independent review. We asked for an independent review because, sadly, the government carried out a review that wasn't exhaustive and didn't really include many of the key stakeholders like disabled people. We now learn today that it's an interim review and there's going to be a review published in the summer. So I'm lost for words, really, as to what to say about that, other than can I make a final plea to the government once again to ensure that they include disabled people as part of it. Involving committees that are linked to the LGA is not consulting with the 14 million potentially disabled people that live, including myself. Now, the issue around blue badges, again, it is a shame that the government have come forward with no solutions to the petitioners that are here today in relation to how we can ensure anybody that is the holder of a blue badge can be exempt from any such schemes. So, in all, I mean, ultimately, Mrs. Harris, it is disappointing, but nonetheless, the conversation still needs to go on because, as we say, low traffic neighbourhood schemes can work if they are done properly, if they are led by evidence and they are fully inclusive and accessible to us all. So thank you.
The question is that this House has considered e-petitions 632748 and 651094 relating to the low traffic neighbourhoods and accessibility. As many are of that opinion, say aye. Of the contrary, no. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.
The proceeding has ended. 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 The proceeding has ended.